At age 7, Spartan boys were torn from their mothers and thrown into a world of starvation, freezing nights, and mandatory violence. This wasn't just a school, it was the Agoge, a brutal forge designed to break the weak and temper the survivors into living weapons. And the story of how it worked is stranger, darker, and more psychologically sophisticated than anything the movies have shown you. If you want more stories like this, the ones history keeps trying to bury, subscribe now. There are thousands of years still left to uncover. To understand the Agoge, you have to first understand what Sparta was trying to solve. Every city-state in ancient Greece faced the same fundamental problem. How do you build men willing to stand in a line, shields locked, spears forward, while the ground shakes with the weight of an enemy army charging directly at their faces? How do you extinguish the survival instinct, the oldest, most deeply wired instruction in the human nervous system, and replace it with something that serves the city instead of the self? Athens answered that question with philosophy and citizenship and the civic pride of free men defending their own homes. Sparta answered it differently. Sparta decided the answer was to begin before a boy was old enough to know what was being taken from him. The result was the most systematically engineered human being in the ancient world. Not the strongest, not the most naturally gifted, but the most deliberately constructed, the most precisely broken and rebuilt in a specific shape, the shape of something that would not break when everything around it was breaking. We know the Agoge existed because multiple ancient sources describe it. Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, Xenophon's Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, Thucydides' observations on Spartan behavior in battle. These accounts don't entirely agree on every detail. They were written by outsiders, by men who watched the products of this system with a mixture of horror and fascination. But the core is consistent enough to reconstruct. And when you reconstruct it carefully, what you find is something that didn't just produce warriors. It produced a psychology. One that the ancient world had never seen before and has never quite been replicated since. Let's begin at the beginning. Before the Agoge even started, before a boy was old enough to be taken, Sparta performed a selection that the rest of Greece considered either admirably rational or deeply monstrous, depending on which city you asked. Newborns were inspected. The father of a newborn child in Sparta did not have the right to simply keep his own son. He was required to bring the infant before a group of elders, tribal elders, men selected for their judgment, not their sentiment, who examined the child for signs of physical deficiency. If the child appeared weak or deformed or simply insufficient, it was exposed at the foot of Mount Apothetai, left to die. Or, in some accounts, to be found and raised by helots, the enslaved underclass that worked the Spartan agricultural economy. The line between those two outcomes was thin, and the Spartans likely didn't consider it their concern either way. What matters for understanding the Agoge is not the exposure itself, though that practice tells you something important about the society that produced it, but the logic behind it. The Spartans were not being cruel for the sake of cruelty. They were being precise. They believed they were identifying, at the earliest possible moment, which human material was worth investing in, and eliminating the rest before resources were expended on something that would not return the investment. This is the first principle of the Agoge, stated in its most naked form before the Agoge even begins. The city's needs come before the family's, before the mother's grief, before the father's pride, before anything that belongs to the private self. Sparta would repeat this principle, in increasingly sophisticated forms, for the next 20 years of a boy's life. But the formal process didn't begin until age 7, and what happened at 7 is worth sitting with, because it wasn't just the removal of a child from his home, it was the deliberate destruction of the first self, the self that had been formed in warmth and privacy and maternal certainty, the self that knew its own name as something that belonged to it personally. On the day of entry into the Agoge, that self was not gradually transitioned away from. It was severed. Quickly, intentionally, without ceremony, designed to soften the blow. Because softening the blow was the opposite of what the system required. Boys were grouped into units, Agoge, which translates roughly as herds or packs, and placed under the authority of older boys, and ultimately a man called the paidonomos, the child herder, whose job was not to nurture, but to oversee, to test, and to report. The first night away from home was not the hardest part. The first weeks were. The psychological literature on attachment separation describes what happens to children forcibly removed from primary caregivers in terms that the Spartans would have recognized as the exact thing they were trying to produce. Protest, despair, detachment. The Agoge wanted detachment. Not the pathological kind, not the complete collapse of emotional capacity, but a specific, redirected version. The bonds that had attached the boy to his mother, his father, his home, his name as a private possession, needed to break cleanly. And out of the breaking, new bonds needed to form, to the pack, to the unit, to the city. This is not an accident of the process. It is the process. Every element of the early Agoge was engineered to accelerate this transition. Boys were deliberately underfed. Not starved to the point of dysfunction, but kept in a state of chronic, mild hunger that made comfort impossible and forced constant vigilance. The food they did receive was distributed communally, which meant that how well you ate depended on how well you performed, how well you cooperated, how well you contributed to the pack's collective standing. Hunger is one of the oldest and most powerful motivators in the human nervous system. The Spartans used it the way a craftsman uses a tool, not to punish, to shape. They were also deliberately underclothed, a single garment, year-round. The winters in the Peloponnese are not Arctic, but they are genuinely cold, and sleeping on ground-cut reeds with inadequate covering in a Spartan winter is not comfortable. That was the point. Pain, cold, hunger. These were not punishments for failure in the early Agoge. They were the baseline condition. You couldn't escape them by succeeding. You couldn't avoid them by being obedient. They were simply the weather of the new world these boys had entered. What this produced over months and then years was a recalibrated nervous system. The normal human threshold for discomfort, for complaint, for the seeking of relief, all of it was pushed back. Slowly, systematically, through sheer accumulated exposure. Pain stopped registering as a crisis requiring response and began registering as information requiring management. This distinction between pain as crisis and pain as information is one that modern sports psychology, military psychology, and performance research has returned to repeatedly. It is not a Spartan invention in the sense of being uniquely discovered by them, but the Spartans applied it more comprehensively, more deliberately, and earlier in human development than perhaps any other society we know of. They understood, without the vocabulary of neuroscience, that the window for this kind of recalibration is wider in children than in adults. And they used that window. By the time a boy had been in the Agoge for 2 or 3 years, his baseline experience of discomfort had been so thoroughly normalized that conditions which would constitute genuine hardship for a normal adult were simply the ordinary texture of daily existence. He didn't endure them heroically. He didn't notice them particularly. That was the goal. But physical hardening was only the visible layer, the more interesting layer, and the layer that made Spartan soldiers psychologically distinct from every other fighting force of the ancient world, was what happened below the surface. The Agoge didn't just change bodies. It changed the architecture of the self. Let's talk about the crypteia. The crypteia is one of the most disturbing elements of the Spartan system, and also one of the most revealing. Descriptions of it vary across ancient sources, but the core of it seems to have been this. Selected young men from the Agoge, the most capable, the ones approaching full warrior status, were sent out alone into the Laconian countryside at night with a knife and no supplies. Their mission was to survive. And, according to some accounts,
to kill helots, specifically to identify and eliminate helots who were considered dangerous. Strong ones, intelligent ones, ones who showed the kind of individual capability that might, if left to develop, produce a threat to Spartan control of the enormous enslaved population that made their entire economic system function. The Krypteia was, on one level, a terror tactic, a tool of demographic management through selective assassination. But inside the Agoge, it served a different purpose. It was the final examination. Not in any formal sense. There were no grades, no certificates, no official designation of completion. But the young man sent out into the darkness alone, with minimal tools and the requirement to survive and act effectively without supervision or support, was being tested on everything the Agoge had built. Could he read the landscape? Could he suppress his own fear well enough to think clearly in conditions of genuine danger? Could he act decisively when the cost of wrong action was his own life?
These are not abstract military virtues. They are specific psychological capacities, and they are not naturally present in most human beings. They have to be built, deliberately, over years, through exactly the kind of systematic stress exposure the Agoge had been applying since age 7. The Krypteia was the proof of concept. If it worked, if the young man returned, having survived, having completed his mission, then the system had worked. Something had been built that would not collapse when the support structures around it were removed. If it didn't work, you found that out in the countryside at night instead of in the line of battle with 800 other men depending on you. The Spartans were not sentimental about the distinction. There is something else worth noting about the Krypteia, something that the ancient sources hint at without fully articulating. The young man sent out alone wasn't just being tested on survival and effectiveness. He was being tested on his relationship to oversight. The most sophisticated element of the Agoge was not the physical hardening, not the hunger, not even the Krypteia. It was the cultivation of a specific psychological architecture in which the internal monitor, the part of the self that evaluates behavior, functioned identically whether the soldier was observed or not. Most human beings behave differently when watched. The Spartans spent 20 years trying to eliminate that difference. The constant surveillance of the early Agoge, the paidonomos, the older boys, the community of citizens who all considered every Spartan youth their collective responsibility, was not primarily about catching misbehavior. It was about internalizing the standard, making the presence or absence of external observers irrelevant to behavior. By the time a Spartan soldier stood in a phalanx, he was not behaving well because someone was watching. He was behaving well because the watching had become internal, because the community's standards had been so thoroughly absorbed that they functioned as his own judgment, his own voice, his own measure of himself. This is the most technically sophisticated achievement of the Agoge, and it's the one that is least discussed when people talk about Spartan training. Everyone talks about the cold nights and the hunger. Fewer people talk about what 20 years of systematic social observation does to the structure of the self, how it dissolves the boundary between internal and external standard, how it produces a human being for whom performance and behavior are not separable categories, because the performance never ends, because the audience never leaves, because eventually the audience is inside. Modern psychology calls this internalized regulation. The Spartans called it Spartan. Now let's talk about language. The ancient world noticed something peculiar about Spartan speech. Not just that Spartans were unusually silent, though they were, and the silence was remarked on enough that it became a kind of cultural signature, but that when they did speak, they spoke differently. Shorter sentences, harder words, nothing wasted. The word laconic, meaning brief and pithy in speech, comes directly from Laconia, the region of the Peloponnese where Sparta was located. It entered the language because the Spartan style of speech was distinct enough to deserve its own name. This wasn't an accident of character. It wasn't simply that Spartans were taciturn by temperament. it was trained. The Agoge included explicit linguistic conditioning. Boys were taught to speak with precision and economy. Long, elaborate speech was associated with Athens, with sophistry, with the kind of decorative verbal performance that Spartans regarded with something between contempt and suspicion. In Sparta, the person who used many words to say a thing was probably trying to conceal that they didn't know what the thing was. Clarity under pressure is one of the hardest cognitive capacities to maintain. In conditions of extreme stress, combat, emergency, crisis, the verbal processing systems degrade. Language becomes harder. Sentences fragment. Communication breaks down precisely when it is most needed. The Spartan solution was to reduce the language to the minimum required, so that even the degraded version remained functional. If your baseline is elaborate speech, combat reduces you to incoherence. If your baseline is 10 words or fewer, combat reduces you to 7. 7 is still enough. The famous examples of laconic wit are not just entertaining anecdotes. They're diagnostic evidence of a communication system designed for specific conditions. When Philip of Macedon, Alexander's father, one of the most powerful military commanders in the ancient world, sent a message to Sparta, saying that if he entered Laconia, he would raze Sparta to the ground, the Spartan response was a single word: if. This is not casual cleverness. This is the product of a communication philosophy that had been systematically instilled for generations. Every word carries weight because no words are wasted. The silence around that single word carries everything else. Philip did not enter Laconia. The linguistic training of the Agoge also served a deeper purpose that is easy to miss. It wasn't just about battlefield communication. It was about ego. Elaborate speech is, among other things, a vehicle for the self. Long sentences tend to contain a lot of I. They perform the speaker. They put the speaker's intelligence and eloquence and opinion on display. They draw attention to the individual producing them. Spartan training didn't just shorten sentences. It shortened the self. The individual ego, the part of a person that requires acknowledgement, that wants recognition, that measures its worth against the esteem of others, was not permitted to grow large in the Agoge. Not because Spartans lacked ego entirely. They were intensely proud people, intensely competitive, intensely concerned with standing and honor. But the pride was collective. The competition was internal. The standing was always relative to the unit, never to the outside world. This is a subtle but critical distinction. A Spartan warrior could be burning with the desire to distinguish himself, to be recognized as the finest soldier in his unit. But that desire was useful only insofar as it pushed him to perform better in service of the phalanx. The moment individual ambition began to pull against unit cohesion, the moment personal glory became more important than collective function, the system had failed. And the Agoge spent years making sure the system didn't fail. The mechanism for this was the syssition, the communal mess, the shared meal. Every Spartan citizen, regardless of individual wealth or family standing, ate together. This was not metaphorical communal dining. It was compulsory. You could not opt out of the syssition. You could not eat at home with your family in preference to eating with your unit. The meals were simple, deliberately so, because the point was not the food. The point was what the food represented. Equality of condition, shared table, shared food, shared standing. The most famous dish served at Spartan communal messes was black broth, a preparation of pork cooked in its own blood with vinegar and salt. Visitors from other Greek cities who tried it invariably reported that it was disgusting. A king of Pontus, having tasted it, reportedly said he now understood why Spartans faced death so willingly. The Spartans ate it every day, not because they loved it, because the eating of it together was a ritual of collective identity. Every man at that table had come through the same system. Every man at that table had gone cold and hungry and had learned to endure in the same specific way. The black broth was a symbol eaten with every meal, a reminder of the forge they had all passed through, a daily reinscription of shared identity. But the Sicilian was also an instrument of accountability. Entry into the Sicilian required approval from existing members. If even one member voted against you, you were rejected. Rejection from the Sicilian meant rejection from the body of Spartan citizens. It meant the loss of everything the Agoge had promised: the standing, the identity, the place in the only community that mattered. This created an accountability structure of remarkable sophistication. Every Spartan knew that his continued membership in the community depended on his continued worthiness in the judgment of his peers. Not the judgment of officials, not the judgment of laws, the judgment of the men who sat across the table from him every night, who had watched him train and fight and fail and recover, who knew his actual quality rather than his performed quality. You cannot fake it at the Sicilian, not for 20 years, not in the specific, detailed, daily way that unit life reveals character. The other Spartans would know. And this brings us to the mechanism that ancient observers consistently identified as the deepest driver of Spartan behavior. Not the fear of death, the fear of shame. Plutarch, who wrote about Sparta with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a system genuinely foreign to his own experience, noted that Spartan mothers sent their sons into battle with a specific instruction: come back carrying your shield or carried on it. Return victorious or return dead. The shield, being large and heavy, was the first thing a fleeing soldier dropped. Coming home without it was the announcement of cowardice. The mothers knew this. They said it anyway, because in Sparta, the social consequence of cowardice was worse than the physical consequence of death. This is not a cliché. It is a carefully engineered psychological reality. The Agoge had spent years making the community's judgment the most important evaluative force in a Spartan's inner life. More important than personal safety, more important than physical comfort, more important than the survival instinct that every human nervous system is wired with at birth. When you make shame more unbearable than pain, you have done something extraordinary to the human threat response system. You have not eliminated fear. You cannot eliminate fear. It is too deep, too old, too biologically fundamental. But you can redirect it. You can change what the nervous system registers as the primary threat. For most human beings, the primary threat in battle is physical: death, injury, pain. For a properly conditioned Spartan, the primary threat in battle was social: failure, cowardice. The look on the face of the man next to you when you flinch. This is why the phalanx worked. The phalanx, as a fighting formation, requires every man in the line to hold his position. It sounds simple. It is not simple. Every biological instinct a human being possesses is screaming at you to move, to run, to get your body out of the path of the thing coming toward it. Holding the line means overriding that signal thousands of times for the duration of the engagement. Most armies in the ancient world held until the pressure became unbearable, and then they broke. Spartan armies held longer, not because Spartans were less afraid biologically, but because the Agoge had spent 20 years ensuring that the social cost of breaking exceeded the biological cost of staying. If you run, you face your peers afterward. If you hold and die, you don't have to. The mathematics of this, in a mind shaped by the Agoge, favored staying. And now, years after the last graduate of the Agoge entered the ranks, centuries after Sparta itself became a Roman tourist attraction, it is worth asking what this system actually produced. Not in the battlefield statistics. Those are well documented. The Spartans at Thermopylae, the Spartans at Plataea, the unbroken Spartan phalanx across 2 centuries of Greek warfare. But in the human beings, what was it actually like to be someone the Agoge had finished with? Plutarch describes Spartan warriors in battle as calm, not the heightened, urgent calm of someone suppressing panic, but a genuine physiological steadiness that observers found eerie. They adjusted their armor carefully before engagements. They dressed their hair. Spartans kept their hair long and combed it before battle.
another practice that seemed bizarre to the rest of Greece until someone explained that long, well-kept hair was considered beautiful, and that Spartans believed a man should look his best on the day he was most likely to die. This is not the behavior of men acting brave. This is the behavior of men for whom the category of bravery no longer applies in the way it applies to everyone else. Bravery, in ordinary usage, means overcoming fear. The Agoge had tried to remove the thing that needed overcoming. Not fear itself, but fear as a disruptive force. Fear as something that interferes with clear perception and effective action. The Agoge had tried to produce men for whom the biological signal of fear was simply information, processed and used and set aside, the way a carpenter processes the grain of wood before deciding how to cut it. Whether they fully succeeded is debatable. Human biology doesn't negotiate entirely. But they succeeded enough that the result was visible on battlefields across Greece, visible enough that enemies dreaded them by name, visible enough that philosophers in Athens and historians in Rome spent considerable effort trying to understand what Sparta had done and whether it could be replicated. It could not be fully replicated, because the Agoge was not a training program in the way that phrase is currently used. You could not take it and adapt it for your own army. You could not excerpt the useful parts and leave the rest. It was total. It began at birth and it never ended. It required an entire society to be organized around the production of this single type of human being. It required the subordination of every other social good, art, philosophy, commerce, family life, individual aspiration, to the production of the warrior and the functioning of the phalanx. Sparta produced almost no literature, almost no philosophy, almost no architecture worth remembering. The Spartans built in wood rather than stone, because building in stone required resources and attention that belonged to the military function. Athens built the Parthenon. Sparta built men. This is the cost that modern admirers of Spartan discipline tend to slide past. The Agoge worked. In the specific, narrow sense of producing exactly the type of human being it was designed to produce, it worked extraordinarily well. The psychology it created was real. The courage it produced was genuine.
The unit cohesion it forged held under conditions that broke every other fighting force in the ancient world, but it produced nothing else. A society that optimizes entirely for one output gets that output and loses everything adjacent to it. Sparta's cultural production is essentially blank. We study Spartan military psychology with fascination, and we study it almost entirely through sources written by Athenians, because the Spartans did not write about themselves. They were too busy being what they had made themselves into. There is something worth sitting with in that fact. The modern fascination with Spartan discipline, and it is genuine and widespread, and surfaces constantly in military training, in elite sports psychology, in productivity culture, in the particular aesthetic of gyms and supplements and motivational content that appropriates the Spartan iconography, tends to focus on the virtues without the costs, the discipline without the isolation, the mental toughness without the suppression of everything that mental toughness was suppressing, the phalanx without the question of what the men in it had given up to stand there. Modern high-performance psychology has, in fact, rediscovered many of the mechanisms the Agoge employed. Controlled stress exposure to build physiological resilience, cold and discomfort training to expand the threshold of tolerance, unit cohesion and shared identity to override individual survival instinct, the internalization of standards through repetition until external oversight becomes unnecessary. These are real mechanisms. They work within limits, in the contexts where they're applied. Special forces selection, elite athletic programs, certain kinds of corporate culture. But modern versions apply them selectively, in bounded contexts, to adults who chose the exposure, with identities that were already formed before the selection began. The Agoge applied them totally to children, without consent, before the self was formed. That distinction matters. What the Agoge built was not enhanced human beings, it was re-engineered ones. Beings for whom the ordinary human equipment, the capacity for individual joy, for private aspiration, for the kind of love that belongs to one person rather than to the unit, had been systematically reduced to make room for something else. Whether that trade was worth it depends entirely on what you think human beings are for. If they are for the city, the Agoge was a triumph. If they are for themselves, it was a crime that produced useful results. The Spartans would not have understood the question as a question. For them, the city and the self were the same thing, and the man who couldn't see that had simply not been properly educated. That was what the Agoge was for, to make the city and the self indistinguishable, to produce human beings who did not experience the subordination of the individual to the collective as a loss, because the individual had been shaped from the beginning to experience the collective as the self, to make the phalanx not a constraint on the warrior, but his truest expression. Whether that represents the perfection of human possibility or its most elegant violation is a question the ancient world left open. We're still trying to answer it. Somewhere in the hills above modern Sparta, which is a small, quiet town that sits on top of the ancient site without much ceremony, there are places where the terrain itself hasn't changed since the Agoge sent boys out into it at night to learn what they were made of. The same hills, the same darkness, the same cold that comes off the Taygetos mountain range in winter. The boys are gone. The phalanx is gone. The city that produced both is gone, absorbed long ago into larger histories, survived mainly as an idea. The idea that the self can be deliberately shaped into something other than what it would naturally become, that human beings are not fixed, that the mind's relationship to hardship is a product of training rather than circumstance. That idea has never left. It shows up in every generation's version of elite training, in every culture's argument about what toughness is and how it's produced and what it costs, in every philosophy of self-improvement that asks whether comfort is the enemy of growth and whether the answer to that question might require something more radical than most people are prepared to accept. The Spartans asked it more radically than anyone else, and the answer they built, the answer they pressed into 20 years of cold nights and shared meals and the specific silence of men who had been trained since childhood to say only what was necessary, still echoes. Not because it was right, but because it worked, and because the question it was answering never went away. How do you build a human being who will not break? The Agoge said, you begin at 7, and you don't stop.
You take everything that makes the breaking possible, the attachment to comfort, the love of self, the biological prioritization of survival over collective function, and you replace it systematically with something else. Something the city can use, something that will stand in the line and hold, something that, when the ground shakes and the spears are coming and the man next to you is bleeding and the natural world is screaming at every nerve ending to run, will not run. That was the Agoge's answer. It was a terrible answer. It was also, for the specific problem it was designed to solve, a nearly perfect one. The question of what that combination means, terrible and perfect simultaneously, is one the ancient world embedded in the story of Sparta like a splinter. It has never stopped working its way toward the surface. If you want more stories like this, the ones history keeps trying to bury, subscribe now. There are thousands of years still left to uncover.